They never meant for this to survive. Not in ink, not in memory, not in whispers passed between walls that learned to listen. There are places where history stopped speaking. Not because nothing happened, but because what happened could not be named without consequence. Basements like this one were never designed to be remembered. They were built to absorb sound, to swallow breath, to keep truths low enough that even God would have to lean down to hear them. What they never wrote down was not an accident. It was a decision in the surviving ledgers. There are dates with no events, days where entire hours vanish. Names appear once and are never mentioned again. Inventories list tools, chain cloth, sugar, but never purpose, never reason, never outcome. And when historians later tried to stitch the gaps together, they found only smooth silence, as if the absence itself had been carefully polished. No official record explains why the basement was reinforced long after the main house was completed, why the walls were thicker below ground than above it, why a second staircase was added that did not appear on the original plans, or why that staircase was later sealed, its entrance bricked over from the inside. Those who knew never spoke again, at least not publicly. The first mention appears in a letter that was never sent, folded, unfolded, then folded again. The ink fades mid-sentence, as if the writer stopped breathing before finishing the thought. It describes the lower rooms only once, and only indirectly, as a place where sound behaved differently, where voices did not echo the way they should, where footsteps seemed to hesitate before landing. The letter was found behind a false drawer, decades later, after the house had already changed hands 3 times. No name signed it, no date, just a trembling line at the bottom, pressed so hard it tore the paper. They told us not to ask what happens when the door closes. What door exactly is never clarified. By the late 18th century, this plantation was already considered unusually quiet. Visitors commented on it without understanding why. The fields were productive, the accounts balanced, the enslaved population was large, yet there were fewer recorded punishments than neighboring estates, fewer public whippings, fewer visible scars. This absence was noted as efficiency. No one asked what replaced the spectacle. Below the house, the basement remained locked. Servants were instructed not to clean there. Repairs were handled by the same 3 men every time, men who did not stay long, and whose names do not reappear in parish records afterward. Deliveries arrived at night. Barrels marked for storage were never moved upstairs. Some were rolled in full. Some were carried out empty. The soil beneath the foundation compacted differently than the surrounding land. Later surveys would show anomalies, density where there should have been air, hollowness where stone should have resisted the probe. When questioned, the owners blamed moisture, termites, time. Time was always the answer. But time does not explain the rules. No one was allowed below alone. No one was allowed to bring a light unless instructed. No one was allowed to speak once the inner door closed. These instructions appear nowhere official. They survive only in repetition, in the way later generations remembered them without remembering why. A former overseer, long retired, would eventually confess something strange to his grandson. He said the basement was not used often, only when something went wrong above ground, when a refusal lasted too long, when obedience failed without explanation, when silence itself became suspicious. The grandson laughed, thought it was a story meant to frighten children, until he asked where the overseer learned those rules. The answer came after a pause long enough to change the air in the room. They were already in place when I arrived. No official record explains who designed them. The first floor of the house was built for display. Wide windows, polished wood, a place where visitors were meant to feel comforted by order. But below it, the basement was shaped differently. Not symmetrical, not elegant. It narrowed where it should have opened. Corners curved inward instead of out. Sound behaved badly there, swallowed at some angles, amplified at others. If you stood in the center and spoke, your voice did not return to you. It went somewhere else. The enslaved were not told what the basement was for. They were told only when not to go near it. Children learned the boundary early. Animals avoided it instinctively. Dogs refused to descend the steps even when commanded. Once, during an inventory inspection, an outsider asked what was kept below. The owner smiled and said, "Things that don't need light." That sentence appears nowhere in the official correspondence, but it appears again years later in the margin of a prayer book found in a locked chest, written by a different hand, smaller, almost careful. Things that don't need light learn to live without it. What happened in that basement was never meant to be recorded, because recording requires language, and language requires agreement. Whatever occurred below the house did not fit the word available to describe it, not legally, not socially, not safely. To name it would have been to admit that control did not always look like violence. That punishment did not always leave marks. That obedience could be manufactured quietly, without witnesses, without blood, without noise loud enough to travel upstairs. Those who entered the basement did not emerge changed in ways that could be easily explained. Some became compliant beyond expectation. Some stopped speaking entirely. Some resumed their labor with perfect precision, and an absence behind the eyes that others noticed but never addressed. And some were never seen again, not listed as deceased, not listed as sold, not listed at all. No official record explains their disappearance. Only the basement remained, locked, reinforced, waiting, and long after the last owner died, long after plantations ceased production, long after the ledgers were archived and the sugar fields returned to weeds, the lower rooms remained intact, sealed, as if whatever had been done there was not finished yet. What they never wrote down was how quickly the rules collapsed once no one was officially watching. The plantation did not fall all at once. It thinned, authority weakened quietly, like what hollowed from the inside. When the last owner died without an heir willing to stay, the house was left to caretakers who knew the surface rituals but not the deeper reasons behind them. They followed habits without understanding purpose. Locked doors remained locked simply because they always had been, until one night, a key was used. There is no record of who turned it first, only that, sometime between the abandonment of the fields and sale of the land, someone entered the basement without permission that no longer existed. The caretaker later described the moment as an accident. He said he was searching for tools rumored to be stored below. He said the stairs felt steeper than he expected. He said the air changed halfway down, not colder, not warmer, but heavier, as if it resisted breath. He said he stopped speaking without realizing he had done so. This detail matters, because no one had told him the rule. The door at the bottom of the stairs was not locked. That alone should have been alarming. Its hinges had been reinforced from the inside, not the outside. Whoever designed it expected pressure to come from within. The room beyond was not empty, but it was not full either. The caretaker struggled later to describe what he saw. He said there were marks on the walls that did not resemble writing, but were too deliberate to be damaged. Lines that repeated with small variations, as if someone had tried to say the same thing many times and failed slightly differently each time. He said the floor bore impressions that did not match furniture. And he said there was a smell that did not belong to rot or mold. It smelled used. When he tried to leave, he realized he had lost a sense of direction. The door he had entered through no longer appeared where it should have been. Sound behaved strangely. His footsteps arrived before his feet landed. His breathing echoed ahead of him. This is where most accounts would exaggerate. This one does not. He found the exit eventually. Or it found him. He could not say which. What matters is what he carried out without knowing it. In the weeks that followed, the caretaker changed. He became precise, efficient. He stopped asking questions entirely. When asked about the basement later, he refused to discuss it, not with fear, but with something closer certainty. "It's not for talking," he said once. "Talking makes it worse." Worse than what? He never answered. When the estate was finally sold, the new owner commissioned a survey, practical, modern, confident in the superiority of his time. The surveyors mapped the structure thoroughly, except for the basement. They marked it as irregular substructure. One of them tried to redraw it 3 times. Each version conflicted with the last. Angles refused to align. Measurements contradicted themselves. A corridor appeared longer on paper than it was in person. Another seemed to shorten the more carefully it was measured. Eventually, the lead surveyor crossed it out entirely and wrote a single note beside it. Non-essential. This is how erasure happens. Not with fire, with dismissal. But the basement did not stay quiet. During renovations, workers uncovered sealed sections of wall that did not correspond to any known modification period. The mortar was older than the house itself, older than the plantation, which meant something had existed there before the structure above was built. A decision had been made to build over it. No official record explains why. Behind one sealed section, they found a secondary chamber. Smaller, lower. The ceiling forced even short men to stoop. There were no restraints, no chains, nothing that could be cataloged easily. Only the walls. They were smoother here, worn by contact. Someone had spent a long time standing very close to them. Pressed there, listening. Scratches appear at shoulder height, repeated at regular intervals, like counting marks. Except the counts reset repeatedly, never reaching a conclusion. One worker laughed nervously and said it looked like prayer. Another said it looked like rehearsal. They filled the chamber back in that same day. No one wanted it open. That night, one of the workers did not return to his lodging. He was not found in the basement. He was not found anywhere on the property. His belongings remained untouched. The foreman wrote a letter requesting assistance. It was never sent. Instead, he crossed out the request and wrote a shorter note beneath it, resolved internally. No official record explains how. What they never wrote down was that the basement was not a place where things happened. It was a place where things were prepared. The enslaved were not taken there often. That was the illusion. That was a story passed down later. That it was used sparingly, exceptionally. In truth, it functioned precisely because it was rare. Because rumor does more work than repetition. Those summoned below were not chosen at random. They were selected after observation, after silence, after small deviations that did not justify public punishment, but threatened something deeper, individual will. The basement did not break bodies. It reorganized expectation. Those who entered learned very quickly that resistance was not punished directly. It was absorbed, returned, made intimate. No official record explains how this knowledge was transmitted, but it spread. Long before emancipation, the basement was already empty most of the time, not because it was unused, but because it had succeeded. Control no longer required presence. The idea of the basement was enough. Even after the house stood abandoned, local people avoided it. Children dared each other to touch the outer walls, but never the cellar doors. Animals circled wide. Travelers reported unease they could not articulate. One preacher attempted to bless the property decades later. He did not finish the prayer. He said the words would not arrange themselves properly. That scripture felt unfinished there, as if something else had already spoken and refused to yield the space. He left without collecting payment. The land eventually passed into bureaucratic hands. Files, permits, maps, everything was reduced to paper, except the basement. It remained undescribed, unexplained, waiting. And somewhere between what was done there and what was forgotten about it, something shifted. Because places that are built for silence do not forget sound. They store it, they learn it, and when the conditions are right, they begin. What they never wrote down was that the basement did not remain empty when people stopped entering it. Silence is not absence, it is accumulation. Years passed, then decades. The plantation was dismantled piece by piece, wood sold, iron repurposed. Even the house above was altered beyond recognition. Windows sealed, rooms divided, floors reinforced. Everything modernized just enough to forget what it had been. But the basement was never converted. It resisted purpose. When new owners attempted to repurpose it for storage, nothing stayed where it was placed. Barrels rolled inexplicably out of alignment. Tools went missing, then reappeared arranged too carefully to be accidental. Once, a crate was found opened, its contents stacked neatly beside it, untouched. No one claimed responsibility. Eventually, they stopped trying. The first voice was heard during a routine inspection. A municipal clerk, tasked with cataloging properties for tax reassessment, descended the stairs alone. He later said he heard something before he reached the bottom. Not speech, not movement, breathing. It did not sync with his own. He paused, listening, convinced another person was present. He called out. The sound of his voice startled him. It came back altered, delayed by a fraction of a second, as if the room needed time to decide whether to release it. The breathing stopped. He continued downward. The room was empty. No one was found hiding. No evidence of trespass. But when he reached the bottom step, he noticed something that had not been documented before. The walls were marked again. Fresh, not scratched, not carved, pressed. The impressions were shallow, almost respectful, as if whoever made them had learned not to leave damage behind. He returned upstairs shaken, but unwilling to escalate the matter. He wrote nothing in the official report. Instead, he added a separate note in his personal journal that would not be discovered until after his death. It feels like the room remembers how to be used. No official record explains what that means. After that day, the voices became intermittent, always faint, always indistinct, never speaking words that could be transcribed. Listeners disagreed on what they heard. Some described murmuring. Others said it sounded like instruction. One said it sounded like repetition. The same short phrase attempted over and over, each time failing slightly differently. No two accounts match. That is important, because whatever was happening was not broadcasting a message. It was responding. The basement had not been designed to project outward. It was built to receive. A historian encountered the site much later, while researching irregularities in regional slave records. She noticed a pattern. Individuals disappearing from one estate's ledger without appearing in any other. No sales, no death certificates, no escape notices. They simply stopped existing on paper. The pattern led her to the house. She requested access under the pretense of architectural interest. She was allowed inside, but discouraged from entering the basement. The caretaker claimed it was unsafe, damp, unstable. She went anyway. What she found was not what she expected. There were no chains, no cells, no obvious instruments of confinement. What remained was subtler spatial discipline, corners designed to force stillness, narrowings that guided movement without walls, areas where standing felt permitted, and others where it felt incorrect, though no rule was visible. She stood in the center and spoke. Her words did not echo. Instead, something shifted. She later described the sensation as being listened to with intent, not overheard, not monitored, considered. That night, in her lodging, she dreamed of the basement, but the dream did not repeat her experience. It corrected it. She moved through the space differently, stood where she had avoided standing before, waited when she had rushed. When she returned the next day, the room felt altered, not physically, relationally. She did not write about this in her academic notes. She wrote about it in letters she never mailed. The room isn't empty. One letter reads, "It's occupied by what remains when speech is trained out of people." She attempted to locate testimonies, oral histories, anything. The descendants she contacted refused to speak. Some ended conversations immediately. Others claimed ignorance with practiced ease. One elderly man said only this: "It's not a place, it's a method." He refused to elaborate. The historian would later abandon the project entirely. She changed fields, left academia. When asked years later why, she said the research had made her feel observed in places where observation should not persist. She never returned to the house. What they never wrote down was how the basement adapted. It did not decay like the rest of the structure. Moisture avoided it. Mold refused to take hold. Structural integrity remained intact long after surrounding materials weakened, almost as if maintenance was internal. Those who spent extended time near it reported subtle changes. Speech patterns tightened. Movements became economical. Humor faded first, then curiosity. People began finishing tasks they had not consciously started. Efficiency increased. Discomfort did not. Local authorities eventually sealed the basement again, citing safety concerns. New concrete, steel reinforcements, modern locks. This time, the sealing was documented, but the effects did not stop. The voices moved upward, faint at first, barely perceptible, heard only late at night, in rooms directly above the cellar. Sound of pacing without footsteps, the sense of someone standing just outside perception, waiting for instruction that never comes. No official record explains why these experiences ceased when the building was finally demolished, except they didn't. Because when the structure came down, the basement remained. They filled it in, covered it, built over it. A parking lot now occupies the space. Cars come and go. People wait there without knowing why they feel restless, why conversations stall, why phones lose signal briefly, then resume, why standing still there feels incorrect, even unsafe. Nothing visible remains. But what was done in that basement was never meant to be recorded. It was meant to continue. And the worst part is not that it survived, it's that it learned. What they never wrote down was that the basement did not end when the walls did. The parking lot was meant to finish the story. Concrete poured thick enough to silence anything below. Steel mesh laid down like a promise that nothing unfinished could rise again. On paper, the problem was solved. In practice, something shifted. The first complaints were ordinary. People reported discomfort while standing in certain areas, an unexplainable urge to move, to reposition, to stop talking mid-sentence. Security footage showed nothing unusual except patterns. Individuals would pause at the same spots, turn their heads at the same angles, leave earlier than intended. No one stayed long without reason. Then the pauses began to lengthen. One night, a night guard was found standing still at the far edge of the lot, facing a blank concrete wall. He had been there for over an hour. He was not asleep. His eyes were open. When spoken to, he responded politely but did not turn around. Asked what he was doing, he said, waiting for it to finish. No official record explains what he meant. He resigned the next day. Others followed, not dramatically, quietly. Transfer requests, sick leave, resignations without complaint. The site developed a reputation, not of danger, but of interference. Contractors reported delays that made no sense. Equipment malfunctioned only in specific zones. Lines painted on the ground faded faster there than elsewhere. Maintenance crews began referring to the dead spot. The phrase appears nowhere in official documentation. What they never wrote down was that the basement had never required a room. It required conditions. Below ground, it had used architecture. Above ground, it adapted. The historian's abandoned notes would later be reviewed by someone else, not a scholar, but systems analyst tasked with digitizing archival anomalies. He noticed something unsettling. The same behavioral patterns associated with the basement appeared in records from other plantations, different locations, different owners, similar silences, basements reinforced without explanation, substructures built first, houses later, irregular staircases, rooms that appeared briefly in construction plans, then vanished. What connected them was not design, it was function. In each case, there were periods of heightened compliance noted in correspondence. Language shifted, words like orderly settled, improved temperament, appeared suddenly, clustered tightly in time, then disappeared. No official record explains how such consistency could exist without coordination. Unless the knowledge moved, the analyst traced trade routes, ownership networks, family connections. He found patterns of replication, not of buildings, but of ideas. Techniques passed quietly between estates. Trusted overseers transferred temporarily. Consultants who left no trace beyond sudden structural changes below ground. What was shared was not a blueprint. It was an understanding. The basement was not unique. It was a prototype. The rupture came when the analyst noticed something else. The language used to describe the basement's effects did not die with slavery. It evolved. Terms reappeared in later institutional contexts. Not the words themselves, but their logic. Spaces designed to discourage speech. Corridors that subtly altered pace. Waiting rooms where time felt distorted. procedures that required stillness without stating why. No official record explains who made these connections consciously, but they appear, again and again. The basement had outlived its original purpose, because it was never about punishment. It was about rehearsal, training people to internalize boundaries without seeing them, training silence. When the analyst attempted to publish his findings, he encountered resistance that felt disproportionate, not censorship, something softer. Peer reviewers suggested reframing, narrowing scope, removing speculation. Funding evaporated, access was revoked. He was advised repeatedly to focus on documented facts. But the facts were the gaps. He began to experience what others had: delays in speech, the sense of being positioned, of responding to cues that were not consciously perceived. He noticed himself standing in corners during meetings, avoiding certain seats, adjusting posture unconsciously. Efficiency increased. Curiosity diminished. He stopped the research. What they never wrote down was that, once learned, the basement did not need to be taught again. It recognized familiar patterns. The parking lot was eventually renovated. New lighting, fresh lines, surveillance upgraded. For a time, complaints decreased. Then the lights began to fail in a precise order, always from the edges inward, never all at once. When repaired, the failures resumed elsewhere. A technician, frustrated, remarked that it was like the place doesn't want to be fully lit. The phrase stayed. People began using it casually. That was how it spread, not as fear, as habit, as language, as expectation. The rupture was complete when someone realized the basement had begun appearing where it had never been built, in rooms designed decades later, in institutions with no historical connection, in spaces meant for order, not memory. People describe the same sensations, the same silence, the same subtle correction of their behavior. No official record explains how this was possible, because once a method works, it does not stay buried. It moves, and it does not announce itself. It waits until the conditions are right, until someone stands still long enough, until speech hesitates, until the room remembers how to be used. What they never wrote down was that the basement was never meant to be hidden. It was meant to be normal. That realization did not arrive all at once. It surfaced slowly, through contradiction, through the quiet terror of noticing that nothing described so far actually required secrecy to function. Secrecy had only been necessary at the beginning. In the earliest phase, the basement needed walls because it was new, unfamiliar, its effects unpredictable. People had to be guided into it, instructed, conditioned. Architecture did the work that habit could not yet perform. But once the behavior stabilized, the structure became optional. This was the rupture. The analyst understood it one night, while rereading plantation correspondence that had always seemed mundane. He noticed that the most detailed descriptions of the basement coincided with periods of instability, rebellion scares, labor shortages, transitions of ownership. During stable periods, references vanished, not because the basement wasn't used, but because it no longer needed attention. The silence had become self-sustaining. The enslaved were not being broken there. They were being recalibrated. The basement was where people learned the shape of consequence without ever seeing it arrive. No blows were required. No spectacle. No witnesses. Just the certainty that something would respond if one stepped out of alignment. And that certainty, once learned, did not stay underground. This is why the basement appears absent in the records of later years. Control had migrated upward, into posture, into rhythm, into the space between thought and action. What they never wrote down was that the most effective systems of domination do not rely on force. They rely on anticipation. The rupture sharpened when the analyst compared testimony from entirely different centuries. The language was eerily consistent. People spoke of knowing when to stop, of feeling when a line had been crossed, of understanding without being told. No one described a person enforcing the rule. They described the space doing it. That was when the basement stopped being a historical site. It became a pattern. The analyst attempted one final experiment before abandoning the work. He visited a modern facility, not connected to slavery, not built on old land, not historically suspect. He entered a waiting area designed for administrative efficiency, neutral colors, clean lines, no visible authority. He sat. Within minutes, he felt it, the same correction, the same subtle compression of self. People lowered their voices without instruction. Movements synchronized unconsciously. No one challenged delays. No one asked why. Nothing illegal was happening. Nothing violent. Nothing worth documenting. That was the point. The basement had been abstracted. What began as a physical space had become a behavioral technology. This was why records vanished. This was why no one spoke. Because there was nothing left to point to, only outcomes. What they never wrote down was that the basement did not create obedience. It revealed how easily people could be taught to produce it themselves. The rupture reframed everything that came before. The reinforced walls were not to contain violence. They were to remove distraction. The silence was not to hide screams. It was to eliminate feedback. The marks on the walls were not signs of suffering. They were traces of adjustment. People learning how to stand, how to wait, how to erase the impulse to resist before it ever reached language. This is why those who entered often emerged improved. Why punishments decreased. Why compliance rose without explanation. The basement had succeeded because it did not need cruelty. It needed patience. And patience, once embedded, survives generations. No official record explains how this knowledge was preserved. Because it wasn't preserved. It was practiced, passed down informally, reproduced intuitively, recognized by those who needed it. The rupture ends here because after this point, the story stops belonging to the past. The basement is no longer something that happened. It is something that continues. Quietly, legally, respectably. The analyst stopped writing after this realization. His final note was not analytical. It was personal. If this is true, he wrote, then the most dangerous thing about the basement is that it doesn't feel dangerous at all. He never published that sentence. He closed the file. He learned to sit differently, to wait, to finish conversations early. Efficiency returned. Discomfort did not. What happened in that basement was never meant to be recorded, because recording it would reveal something worse than cruelty. It would reveal how ordinary it was. What they never wrote down was that once you recognize the basement, it recognizes you back. Not immediately, not dramatically. Recognition arrives as familiarity. The analyst noticed it first in himself. Not fear, alignment. He found it easier to comply with structures he once questioned. Easier to accept delays without explanation. Easier to remain silent when speech felt unnecessary. These changes did not feel imposed. They felt reasonable. That was the most unsettling part. The basement did not announce itself as oppression. It presented itself as order. After abandoning his research, the analyst attempted to return to a normal life. He took a different job, one with clear expectations, predictable routines. He told himself the past work had simply exhausted him, but patterns followed. He noticed how certain rooms alter behavior, how people instinctively lowered their voices in some spaces, but not others, how seating arrangements produce compliance without instruction, how lighting, ceiling height, and silence collaborated to shape attention. None of this required history. It required design. The basement was no longer behind him. It was everywhere. What they never wrote down was that the basement had always depended on participation. It could not function without people completing it. Silence alone is inert. Architecture alone is neutral. The system activates only when individuals adjust themselves in response, when they sense an invisible boundary and choose not to cross it, when they feel watched without seeing a watcher, when they internalize the room. This is why the voices faded over time. They were no longer needed. The basement had taught enough. In one final attempt to disprove his conclusions, the analyst revisited the old site, now just asphalt and painted lines. He stood in the exact spot where the staircase once descended. He felt nothing dramatic, no pressure, no fear, only suggestion, a gentle awareness of where not to stand. He realized then that the basement no longer required physical continuity. It had migrated into expectation itself, into the shared understanding of how one should behave in spaces designed for compliance. No official record explains how this migration occurred, because it was never planned. It emerged. Those who built the first basement did not invent the method from nothing. They discovered it, observed it, refined it. They noticed that people adapt faster when correction is indirect, that control is more durable when it feels self-generated, that the most effective authority is never seen. And once discovered, this knowledge could not be undiscovered. It survived emancipation. It survived reform. It survived language. It embedded itself in institutions that had nothing to do with slavery, while carrying its logic forward intact. This is why the basement feels familiar even to those who have never heard of it. Why certain rooms make people quiet. Why waiting feels compulsory. Why stillness feels safer than movement. Why resistance feels inappropriate, even when justified. The listener might notice it now. A tightening, a desire to sit straighter, to finish this story quickly, to return to something comfortable. That impulse is not accidental. What they never wrote down was that the basement's final function was election. Not everyone feels it. Not everyone responds. Those who do are the ones it works on best. Those who adjust. Those who wait. Those who learn without being told. The basement does not punish disobedience. It renders it inefficient, unnecessary, embarrassing. This is why the ending is not explosive. There is no revelation that frees anyone. No document uncovered. No final proof. Because proof would require confrontation. And confrontation was never the goal. The goal was continuity. The basement succeeded because it made itself invisible. So invisible that even now, describing it feels like a violation of etiquette, like speaking too loudly in a room designed for quiet. What happened in that basement was never meant to be recorded. It was meant to be inherited. And now, the story begins to close not with an answer, but with a sensation. The feeling that something has shifted slightly, that the room you are in has changed shape, that silence is weight, and that you have already adjusted to it. What they never wrote down was that endings were never part of the design. The basement was not built to conclude anything. It was built to persist, to outlast witnesses, to remain functional even when its origin became irrelevant. That is why there is no final document, no confession, no last testimony discovered in a forgotten archive. Those who understood what the basement truly was did not preserve a knowledge. They embodied it. An embodiment does not leave paper trails. In the years after the analyst abandoned his work, the records he had handled were quietly reclassified, not sealed, not destroyed, simply repositioned, filed under categories that discouraged curiosity, indexed in ways that made connections difficult to trace. This was not a coordinated effort. It did not need to be. Systems correct themselves when deviation is inefficient. Occasionally, someone still notices. A researcher pauses too long over an inconsistency. A designer questions why a space produces obedience without instruction. A visitor feels unease in a room that looks harmless. But most do what the basement taught them to do. They move on. The original site no longer exists. The house is gone. The plantation erased. The basement entombed beneath layers of purpose. There is nothing left to excavate. And yet, the behavior remains. That is the quiet inheritance. What they never wrote down was that the basement does not require belief. It does not demand awareness. It functions best when unacknowledged. Even naming it here feels unstable. Because once articulated, the idea tries to settle back into silence, to become abstract, to lose its edges, to feel theoretical rather than lived. That is how it survives, not as horror, as normalcy. The enslaved who first encountered the basement are long gone, their names missing, their voices unrecovered, not because they had nothing to say, but because what they learned there was not meant to be spoken. It was meant to be carried, passed on through posture, through hesitation, through the knowledge of when to stop before stopping is demanded. Those who knew never spoke again, not because they were silenced, but because silence worked. The most unsettling truth is not what happened in that basement. It is that it never really stopped happening. Only the setting changed. The walls disappeared. The function did not. And now, there is nothing left to uncover. No door to open. No staircase to descend. Only rooms that feel slightly wrong. Pauses that last too long. The sense that somewhere, beneath whatever structure you are currently inside, there's a space designed not to hold bodies, but to shape them. What happened in that basement was never meant to be recorded, and now that you know it existed, notice how quickly the urge arises to forget it, to return to something easier, to adjust, to be quiet. The basement is very good at waiting, and it has all the time it needs.